Rosendorff. He's an associate professor of politics at New York University and is editor of the interdisciplinary journal Economics and Politics. Previously, he was director of the Center for International Studies and associate professor of international relations and economics at the University of Southern California. As you can see, he's going to be speaking today on why do authoritarian regimes sign the Convention Against Torture, signaling domestic politics and non-compliance. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rosendorff.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for the invitation to be here. I appreciate it. It is indeed a pleasure. This is joint work with a graduate student in the Department of Politics at NYU, James Hollier. And we are very interested in essentially trying to understand more broadly the conditions under which countries are willing to sign international agreements. And we think that the CAT, or the Convention Against Torture, raises some very interesting and perhaps slightly counterintuitive notions about why countries sign these international agreements. We also want to talk a little bit about the role of domestic politics and compliance. There is a large debate in the literature about what the determinants are of countries' willingness to comply with their international obligations. And we're going to point to domestic politics as an important avenue of that process. We also want to talk a little bit about the role of international law and whether or not more law is always better or whether more law is always a good idea. So those are sort of the broad issues I'd like you to keep in mind as we proceed. Our focus today is the human rights regimes, treaties, and in particular the United Nations Convention Against Torture. And we want to investigate the conditions under which countries sign these things and either then decide to comply or fail to comply with their obligations under these treaties. The standard notions, right, about international agreements is that states will sign treaties exactly because they intend to comply with them. And in particular, you would expect those states with the lowest costs of compliance to be the ones most likely to join and most likely to comply with their obligations once they've acceded to these treaties. Human rights treaties generate a kind of different pattern, and a somewhat unexpected pattern, a pattern that still to this point remains somewhat unexplained. It seems that countries sign these treaties, and in particular the Convention Against Torture, and then they continue to torture. And so it's as if the treaty has absolutely no bite whatsoever. This is especially true of authoritarian regimes, torturing regimes. And so the question is, why do they sign these agreements, and this particular agreement, the Convention Against Torture, if they have no intention of complying with its obligations? Well, the standard story, right, is that these agreements have very weak compliance mechanisms. There's very little that these countries can do if a state violates its obligations under the treaty. And so therefore you would expect that you could sign and then torture with impunity. But if that were true, then we would expect all authoritarian torturers to actually sign this agreement. And it turns out that's not what we see. What we see is that in fact some sign the agreement and some don't. And so what we'd really like to be able to do is to explain this observed variation in signing behavior. By the way, I don't know what the conventions are, but if you want to interrupt or ask questions, that's fine, or I can go as you wish. So why do authoritarian governments sign treaties and then fail? Well, why do some authoritarian governments sign treaties like this and then fail to comply? That's the first sort of central question of our investigation here. Why don't some authoritarian governments sign the Convention Against Torture? If we can understand the behavior of countries to sign and either comply or not comply, we then may be able to get at some more, some corollaries, some extra questions that will be interesting, which is, what sort of empirical patterns will result. In particular, can we generate a theory that will match the observed empirical regularities in this matter? And more broadly, hopefully, then be able to say something about how effective the international rights regime might actually be in terms of reducing torture. The empirical regularities are these. It turns out that work by Ona Hathaway, by Jim Vreeland, has established that those countries that actually torture are more likely to sign the UN Convention against torture, the CAT, relative to those that torture less. All right? And a number of authors have investigated what the effect of signing has been on the levels of torture in these exceeding countries. And Hafner, Burton, and Tsutsui have shown us that indeed signing has almost no effect on torture levels. And it's also the case that some sign and some do not. In our sample, 74 of the 129 authoritarian regimes between 85 and 96 never signed the agreement. And so what we want to be able to do is have a theoretical model that is consistent with these empirical regularities, that generates some more predictions that we can take to the data, and then hopefully say something more broader about the efficacy of international law. Okay, so what are our key intuitions and our key insights and our key results? And they are these. It's always a good idea to put the results right at the top of the talk, more or less. So that's what I'm trying to do right here. Okay, so what we're going to show is that some authoritarian regimes are going to sign the CAT exactly because they do not intend to comply with it. And they want to be seen not to not be complying with their obligations. Because signing the treaty will be a signal of their toughness to their domestic opposition. All right? Those authoritarian regimes that sign the CAT are going to be signaling that their toughness, that they're a tough type, that they're going to stay in office and they're going to fight it out as long as it's necessary. And therefore, a rational domestic opposition is probably going to understand something about signing the CAT, that this is indeed a tough type and may alter its opposition activity accordingly. In so doing, what we will find as a prediction of the model is that those authoritarian regimes that sign the CAT will survive in office longer. And we will also show that those authoritarian regimes that sign the CAT will continue to torture after signing in equilibrium. So the CAT will lower torture in those states that do in fact exceed, but torture will continue. But since they survive in office longer, we can say that the CAT will have the unanticipated consequence of delaying democratization in those countries that might actually need it most. All right, so that's the key results, and let me show you how we get there. Our central assumptions are these. That torture is a useful device by an elite facing a domestic opposition in order to reduce the effect of the likelihood of their being evicted from office. So torture is a strategy that can be used to protect your hold on office. We're going to assume that the elites have private information about the value of holding office, or alternatively, the private information about the costs that they incur from engaging in torture. And it's a crucial part of the story, which I'm going to try and convince you of, is that the CAT, rather than being meaningless and not worth the paper that it's written on, actually does, in some non-trivial way, add to the costs of engaging in torture if and when the torturer is in fact evicted from office. Okay. With those assumptions, the intuition goes essentially like this. Signing the CAT is going to signal to the domestic opposition that the torturer is of a tough type. That torturer, that elite, that office holder values that office very highly, or alternatively maybe has low private costs of torture. And that this information is private, but the signing of the CAT acts as a credible signal of that information. What we'll see is a separation of types in equilibrium, all right, in which the low cost or the high value torturers sign to signal their toughness. The high-cost torturers, or the torturers for whom holding office has lower value, choose not to sign in equilibrium. Tough types will sign and continue to torture. The domestic opposition is going to learn, by virtue of seeing the signature, that indeed the elite, the ruler, is of a tough type. Given that they're of a tough type, the optimal best response will be to reduce opposition levels of activity, because you know that this is a tough type you're facing. And so the probability of regime change, which will be endogenous to the model, will fall. And what we'll find is that authoritarian signers will survive in office longer than observationally similar non-signatory. So what we'll do then is we'll test this final part of the story in red in order to see if there is indeed consistency